This is going to be the most almighty weapon that someone like Nigel Farage or the Conservatives are going to be able to use to whack him with. Because what I think Starmer has done here is essentially burn the boats. There's no going back now, right?
I was kicked out of the Conservative Party for my tweets against children transitioning by CCHQ has-beens. Now, unless, you gut the institution, replace it with true believers, Kemi, Jenrick, whoever, aren't going to be able to get anything done either.
When Starmer loses in the next election, only 200 people across the whole of the British state will change jobs. 100 ministers, 100 special advisors, people like me, and those special advisors don't even have any actual executive authority. All you can do is say, well, I recommend this, and I've read all those briefings, and they're lying to you again. Please don't sign it, boss, which I got bored of saying, right? Only 200 people change jobs across that whole system. That needs to change. You need to have more people with more executive authority to come in and be able to do some of this stuff. You need to change a lot of this legislation on day one, or you're not going to be able to do it.
There are rumours that he might make a comeback of sorts. There are some internal polls, or maybe even external polls in the Conservative Party that suggest that only swapping Kemi out for him would change their electoral fortunes in any way. Hello and welcome back to Deprogram. This is the NCF show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a contributing editor at the European Conservative magazine, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever now, by Connor Tomlinson, one of the leading contributors at Courage Media, and our special guest this week, James Price, who is a political consultant and I believe former Chief of Staff to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Was that Nadim Zahawi in the middle of 2022? Quite a raucous period, and maybe we can get into some of that later, James. But thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Keir Starmer has lately seems to have summoned the spirit of Enoch Powell, talking about the way in which Britain is fast ascending into a land of strangers. This belongs in some speech made in Birmingham in 1968, I'm sure. But nevertheless, I think it's a sign that there has been a shift in the discourse. And at present, we can roughly see British politics, to start with some topical electoral politics, as being a contest between the Labour government, Reform, and indeed to some extent the Conservatives, to see who can sound the toughest on mass immigration, which of course has been running at disastrous levels since 1997, and has been running at, particularly in my view, nationally suicidal levels since the Boris wave. Who do you think sounds most credible on this issue today, and who do you think is most credible?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. As you say, it's basically existential now, I think, for the future of the country. And I think what Starmer has done is great news for himself, it's great news for Reform, it's great news for the Tories, great news for the country. It's good for everybody because this has become such a horrendous issue. So Starmer either now manages to get a grip on immigration, and get a grip will have to mean tens of thousands. It's not enough, I think, to go from the kind of 800,000 net extra people every single year down to just 300,000. That's not going to cut it. But if he does get it down to meaningful numbers, it'll be something the Tories never managed to do. He will have to slay all kinds of sacred cows. He'll have to change all kinds of sacred legislation, because we know that international law in particular means more to Starmer than anything else does, frankly. And you know what? If he does all that, he will deserve a second term, right? I'd probably end up voting for him at that rate, and I don't believe in a single thing that he believes in any other context. He's not going to do that, and therefore this is going to be the most almighty weapon that someone like Nigel Farage or the Conservatives are going to be able to use to whack him with. Because what I think Starmer has done here is essentially burn the boats. There's no going back now, right? If even the socialist leader of the Labour Party is saying this has been terrible, not just on the economics, but on the social and cultural issues as well. Talking about an island of strangers. I mean, he's obviously right about this, and those of us who still live in London feel that very, very acutely. We were just talking about some of the wonderful incidents that comes up in Sadiq Khan's UK London. But he's also doing it on these social points and on the economy as well. So either he fixes this problem or he doesn't, and Reform and the Conservatives will have a huge amount of ammunition to completely bury Labour over this. Either way, this is a really good week for the future of Britain.
Do you think that Reform... Who do you think... So between... You don't think that Starmer's promises are sincere, and I agree with that. I suspect Connor does as well. Who do you think is currently looking to be the most likely to take advantage of the fact that he has nevertheless shifted the discourse, and there are now not credible, there are now concrete promises to which he can be held? Who is going to be the most predictable candidate for exactly the kind of thrashing that you're saying should now happen?
I mean, the smart money probably at the moment is still on reform, given the kind of the crest of the wave that they've been surfing with the recent election result. And some people have said that this is Labour coming out in response to those big council victories in the by-election that Reform have had. I mean, actually, they announced that they were going to do a white paper, I think, in Christmas, and they announced broadly the time it was going to be announced for about now anyway. Perhaps that was someone being far-sighted in planning for this, knowing they were going to get a drubbing in these local elections anyway. But so I don't think it's entirely 100% reactive to Reform on this. They are in the best position, Reform, except for the fact that they are entirely likely to mess this up now, right? They've got one thing they've got to keep saying: immigration really terrible in the mass level that it's been, put all the caveats in that we can all do as well. But Richard Tice came out in the wake of this announcement and started seemingly defending the care worker visa, which is the most obvious example of a system that has been totally taken advantage of. Saying, oh, those are some of the most deserving people of it. That's not the Reform line, mate. And I think, was it Anne Widdecombe who also said, oh, we never promised net zero immigration. Well, you did at one point. So they're going to have to get their ducks in a row on this issue in order to capitalise on it. And the Conservative Party, again, of course, is compromised by the fact that all of this happened under our watch. And there's not been, I think, enough of an apology from anybody except Robert Jenrick, who I think quite bravely, let's remember, quit Rishi Sunak's government because he didn't think that Sunak was taking this stuff seriously enough. So Jenrick obviously always there waiting in the wings, but I think in general, whatever force it is that comes to face Labour at the next general election has hopefully an almighty weapon to use against the left on this.
I think it's interesting that now Starmer is trying to sprint to catch up to what is seen to be a new centre ground that has been mind-swept by those 6 months ago he and even some in Reform would have derided as the very online right. Hello, everyone. It's us. It's funny. I noticed that it was Rupert Lowe who was banging on for quite some time from his parliamentary questions and on the BBC, upsetting Ash Sarkar, saying that you shouldn't be able to be in this country if you don't speak English. It should be the minimum requirement. 6 months ago, that was the domain of the very on-run. Right now, it's Labour Party policy. So the pipeline is very evident. But I am sceptical as to whether or not just on Starmer's Damascene conversion from saying that, all immigration policy is racist and now we're a nation of strangers, but on the efficacy of the actual policies themselves. Because Jenrick's said that he thinks it's only going to reduce by 50,000 a year. Home Office numbers have said it's going to come down by 98,000 a year. The head of the Migration Advisory Committee said, we'll settle at around 250 to 300,000. But then some Home Office insiders have said, well, actually, net migration is probably going to go up from the OBR models of 350 to 400,000 to 525,000 minimum. So a lot of this seems to be tinkering at the margins and pushing at one end, like the health and social care visa, where they were outnumbered by their dependents 10 to 1. But then at the other end, there might be another visa, so like the Indian workers trade deal visa that he's done, that sees a mass amount of applicants that they haven't accounted for. So to what extent are the actual measures that he's promised in this white paper going to do what he's suggested they're going to do?
Forgive the brief interruption. Now, don't eat breakfast until you learn about caloric bypass. Your breakfast is setting you up for the entire day to either gain weight or lose it. The term breakfast literally means to break your fast that you started the night before. About 4 hours after you eat dinner, your body switches from the nutrients we get from food to the stored glycogen we have in our bodies. Once glycogen stores are depleted, typically after 8 to 12 hours of fasting, the body shifts to burning fat for energy. Fatty acids are released from fat stores where they are converted into ketone bodies through a process called ketogenesis. Then, when you eat breakfast in the morning, the body starts the cycle again. This is where the caloric bypass comes into play. Dr. Gundry, a heart surgeon in California, learned that if you break your nightly fast with something called MCTs, or medium-chain triglycerides, you can actually keep burning fat throughout the day and use it for energy. But there are specific types of foods that contain these MCTs. Using this breakfast breakthrough, he was able to lose 70 pounds just through diet, and he did this in his 60s. You can find out all about it and his exact method by going to thehealthyfat.com/culture. That's thehealthyfat.com/culture. Or click on the link in the description box below. It is important to remember that everyone's body processes fat differently, and it all depends on your unique metabolic type, which is why in the video he released for my special viewers, he talks all about it. It really is quite fascinating and might change the way you think about health. Go to thehealthyfat.com /culture, or click on the link in the description box below. Back to the video.
Yeah, I mean, they're very unlikely to, right? And he did have the little caveat in his speech of saying, and if this isn't enough, we won't hesitate to come back and do some more. And okay, fine, I'll take that. That seems vaguely sensible, but for a party that have been, as you say, pushing at the kind of mad open borders rhetoric for a long time, and every time somebody suggests, well, maybe this family coming over who don't speak any English and will never contribute to the economy and will have to spend huge amounts of money housing and feeding and clothing them and educating them and all the rest of it, and they'll still end up with pretty, barbaric backward views, is not a good thing. Oh, you're racist, all that stuff. This is a good start, right? It's like someone fitting into a new job and not really getting it for a while and having to kind of get used to it. As you say, I think on the meat of it, it's not going to work. It's going to, let's say, for example, you'll have to take us out of various bits of the ECHR and change a lot of domestic statute that are some of Blair's best legacies, right? The Human Rights Act.
Which Starmer wrote the textbook for lawyers to implement.
Precisely. So he will have to go against all of his, I think, most sincerely held beliefs. And I think if you ever speak to most of these sorts of progressive types, they would rather lose. They would rather lose their seats. They would rather lose control of the government because they're not that comfortable being in government anyway, right? They don't really like the kind of mucky, murky compromises that it takes. They will rather lose and go down and say, well, it was bigotry and reform and all this stuff, rather than actually get serious. We saw that Sunak did that as well, and I know we'll get into that in a bit. That Sunak wasn't willing to do the sorts of outside of the box activities that he would have had to have done in order to have a fighting chance at winning that election. The kind of social pressures, the polite society pressures are too much. So as you say, the meat of this, it's not going to cut it, and it's probably not going to cut it by design, because anything more than they're starting to do would be seen to be too nasty. And already he's being compared, as you say, to Enoch Powell or things like that for pretty moderate stuff.
Which was really confusing. Farage gave a statement to BBC Newsnight where he said that Keir Starmer is using the rhetoric of Enoch Powell and he'll probably live to regret it because he'll divide the left. I think there's a fair assessment. I do think Keir Starmer is Stalin-esque enough to wield the ice pick and come out on top for that. But it is funny that Farage is saying you're sounding more right-wing than me. If I may, before I throw it back to Harrison, a follow-up question. You're saying it's good for everyone and the Conservatives. How much of this is him eating the Conservatives' lunch? Because I noticed that when Kemi Badenoch came out with her policy proposal about indefinite leave to remain, something that our mutual friend Sam Bidwell, friend of the show, has spoken about before, he said, 15 years into the future, restrict the countries to net tax contributors and people who are culturally proximate. Here's the printout that you can literally just sign with a Whitehall pen. And Kemi limited herself to 10 years, said she wasn't going to leave the ECHR and wasn't going to repeal the Human Rights Act, just disapply it to immigration cases. Well, Starmer's just done all that. So have the Conservative played it too safe and now have to revise their offering at the next election?
Yes, I think you're right on that. I think you're absolutely right. And again, it's so difficult for the Tories. You watch some of these front benchers saying Labour, what they've just announced, it's not enough. Not just on this topic, but on anything, right? With pension reform, healthcare reform. And it's like, guys, I don't think this is a very effective or compelling argument, given we had all this time and we didn't do very much in it, exactly as you say. And Kemi's got, I think, a very difficult tightrope to walk on this. I'm almost walking up this sentence myself. There is that footage of her as a backbencher talking about how she campaigned for more of this stuff. And just as this is new fertile ground for the Labour Party to come up with, I think it's new for a lot of the Conservative Party, right? The Bible of the party, The Spectator, was full of pieces for a long time talking about how the country didn't really care about high immigration. Look, it's not really mattered at all. This is coming from exactly right, right? And well, exactly right. And the inability to suggest that my American wife or other people's foreign wives or who come along and contribute and all the rest of it,
and not a Somali drill rapper.
Indeed, so right. You took the words out of my mouth, right? And that's a difficult argument for Labour to start making, and their backbenchers aren't enjoying it. Difficult for the Tories to do as well. And you've got to have someone like Jenrick to have that level of credibility because he quit the government, right? He quit the fancy car that drives you home at the end of the night and all the private secretaries bringing you your lunch and sorting out your diary and all those sorts of things because he wasn't willing to stick around knowing the plan wouldn't work.
Or be like Katie Lamb, who's just elected and has made this her key issue.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so whilst there's an element for both of the main parties of Luke 15:7, right? More rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repenteth than 99 just MPs who need not repent. Right? There will be a level of adjustment to this, and if Labour keep bashing the Tories with it, and it keeps all three parties competing with each other to move further to the right and become more restrictionist, more quality over quantity, further and further, again, that will be a good thing for the country. And if it takes the Conservative Party, being whacked for a bit longer in order to get that great outcome, I think that's a sacrifice that Conservatives should make.
What do you think? Well, firstly, I should say that I imagine that Blair has been in Starmer's ear on this point, because not only was he on sort of unveiling the need for there to be greater restrictionist measures taken at the border and using language that no doubt upset considerable portions of his own side of politics. He also revived a Blair line from about 6 months or so ago, where Blair basically said that Brexit, in practice, ended up licensing an open borders experiment in which the least assimilable forms of third world immigration were maximised, and the more assimilable forms of European immigration actually came down, because Europeans partly felt rebuffed, I imagine, as a lot of them went home, rightly or wrongly, but nevertheless, the EEA, net fiscally contributory forms of immigration went down, and the most culturally incompatible and net fiscal drain-like forms of immigration went up. Blair has, to some extent, found ways of trying to make this argument about cultural incompatibility, not so much in terms of clash of values or clash of identities, although, of course, Starmer did talk about an island of strangers, which rather hints at it, but more in sort of pretty hard-headed logistical fiscal terms. And we saw Starmer wheel out that line yesterday. So I think they're probably going to go for something like that. They're going to sort of hint at the point by proxy in order to not to upset too many of their own side, while nevertheless being perceived to be pursuing the interests of the British people. So I imagine that will be the left-wing strategy on this. I also wanted to ask you another question, James. What do you think it says about the monumental lack of ambition on the part of colloquially right-wing parties, whether we're talking about reform or the Conservatives, that often it takes a cynical left-wing politician like Starmer to flip the linguistic script in this way and to provide the permission structure for us to even pursue these sorts of policies? I should say that I think this is a strategy that the left is using at the moment. They've sort of spent years saying you can't say this, you can't say that, and so sort of conservative-minded people like good little boys obey this sort of new narrative structure. And then all of a sudden, they say it themselves, and the rug is torn from underneath them. Mark Carney did a similar thing recently in the Canadian election. He said in his first speech when he rose to the Prime Ministership of Canada, of course, it goes without saying that Canadian identity has always been rooted in our Anglo-French heritage. And it's like the Conservatives, they're like, whoa, we thought we'd not been allowed to say that since the Multiculturalism Act of 1971. And all of a sudden you say it to us and take
Quick, transcribe it into Hindi.
Exactly. And so what do you think? Do you think that there is... it sounds like from your laughter that you agree with me. Why do you think there is this lack of ambition on the part of conservative-minded people in Anglosphere politics?
It's a really big question. It's a really good one. I think that all of us share some blame, all those of us who were serving inside government, either as special advisors or SPADs, certainly MPs, the party bigwigs, the party mechanics in the Conservative Party that was selecting for, as you say, good little boys and girls, yes men, right? Rather than people that had either decent, proper conservative beliefs or people who were actually able to get anything done, right? We're getting people who are just kind of nothing against councillors, but people who have been elected as councillors and not very much because they complete the metric of handing out lots and lots of leaflets, which has been the main criterion for selecting a Conservative Member of Parliament, other than wanting to be a Conservative Member of Parliament, which itself, frankly, should almost be a disqualifier, given the kind of people that we've had, right? We can maybe talk about some of that as well, and some of the wrong-uns that they have been going through, because they have. So I think that's a big under analysed chunk of it, because no one wants to be mean to MPs if you pass them in the street or you're trying to invite them to come on panels and things like that.
Sure.
But the low quality, especially that 2019 intake, has been a real block on this sort of stuff. And that's part of it. I think another bit of it is just the lack of seriousness of understanding quite how much Blair and his coterie changed the rules of the game in the 13 years or so that they had in power. So that David Cameron, George Osborne, I think they were special advisors in the early 90s under John Major. They came into government not realising just how much more power this blob had accrued for itself. And so I think that the lack of a kind of serious, coherent plan, and they had the huge deficit that they inherited and the big financial problems to try and deal with, and trying to keep together a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. So they get a little bit of a pass on some of that. But I guess the lack of having a deep philosophical ideas, lack of talent and ability to get anything done, and a lack of understanding at just how the game was being played. That's partly the blob, whether it's Whitehall, whether it's the Quangos and the regulators and that kind of stuff, and partly, as you say, the kind of rhetorical games that motivated left-wing journalists and commentariat types and other Gramsciites have played that have led us down these traps of going, well, of course, insert horrendously vapid left-wing thing here, because that happened to be on the speaking notes that the minister was given, and they didn't have the wherewithal or the courage or the backing from others to say, this is obviously complete rot. And as you say, that it almost, I don't think it has been done by design, but it has worked out perfectly for various lefties around the world to be able to go and reclaim some of this mantle. Who's that one Labour MP down in Dover? Mike Tapp, right? This guy, I won't actually Mike Tapp.
Expert in British values, of course.
It's just extraordinary,
when
right?
he gets around to defining them.
And and exactly. And it's this whole thing that he goes, well, actually, we're the real patriots, right? And here we are with the Union Jack and good British values, like enjoying a curry on a night, and just stuff that's sort of like parodic, right? Like, and so denigrate. We all like it. And actually, what was the form of curry was a 13th century cookbook that's been kicking around in England, right? Not to denigrate, but it's that like very superficial level of stuff. And he's managing to sound more patriotic than like quite Brexity Tory MPs were in previous years. And so it has just worked out, I think, like magnificently for them to have this tool. The problem is they also have drunk deeply from the well that says we're good people because we're not the Tories, essentially. We're not right-wing, and therefore they're very uncomfortable. They've also been given a weapon to use and are very scared of actually wielding it, right? They could go and say, you're the Tories, you destroyed Britain, we're patriotic, we're going to take it back. But again, they would not be invited to some of the nice parties that they want to be.
There's a story that I'll omit the people involved's name, but you were there, and it was at a drinks event late last year, and we were talking to someone who is familiar with one of the higher up names in Conservative politics. And we said, okay, if they are secretly as on-based world as you claim to be, why did they stand up at the dispatch box and say diversity is our strength for 14 years? And they said, no, what you don't understand is they just had to placate the ministers in the civil service. They had to do... It's like, well, the only reason they had to placate them was because of all this Blairite legislation that was there in the first place, which put things on rails, as you say, that made the civil service ostensibly neutral, that meant that if you tried to fire anyone, you would be accused of politicizing it, that they had to adhere to the public sector equality duty and the Equality Act that you could have scrapped on day one. As you've said before, what Kenny Badenoch should have done as Minister for Women and Equalities is liquidate her own department as a Conservative.
Day one.
Yes. And then the other thing that it brings to mind is, so Chris Philp, who I actually quite like, I think he's quite effective, especially on the grooming gang stuff. Over the weekend, when there was that new Telegraph story about the man whose house was raided for having Douglas Murray books and copies of The Spectator and, Brexity things, because he put a tweet out that upset some Palestinian liberation activist. Chris Philp said, okay, on day one, we're going to abolish non-crime hate incidents. And it was put to him that, well, this wasn't a non-crime hate incident. This was prosecuted under the Public Order Act, as was the guy who burned the Quran. This was prosecuted under the Malicious Communications Act. This is down as a racially and religiously aggravated hate crime charge for the burning of the Quran. The only person that seems to get those details is Robert Jenrick, Katie Lamb, who've dug into the legislation. It seems to me that there's an insufficient attention to legislation and detail by the Conservatives, and resting on their laurels by the briefings given to them by the civil service sort of push them in a leftward direction. So is there a solution to ministers either having to be so attentive they have to do the work of the department themselves, like Jenrick, or is there a solution to actually getting decent briefings by an ideologically corrupted civil service?
Yeah, you've identified exactly the thicket that the Blairites managed to build up through legislation, as well as massively increased budgets, as well as farming stuff out to other bits of the blob that you then don't have to think about. And we can talk about that as well, the kind of regulators and the quangos and things like that. And loads of examples of that carried on under the Conservatives, because the kinds of people who were being made ministers were all too keen, and frankly, people in Parliament of all sides were all too keen not to have power. Right, that Parliament is meant to be sovereign. It's meant to be almost this sort of dictatorship where you can do whatever you want for 4 years. There are no checks and balances, all of the rest of it. That is pretty daunting, right? In a big state where you've got a big budget and all the rest of it, it's not the kind of much smaller night watchman that you'd have had maybe in the 19th century. That is a big scary responsibility to have that much responsibility and power. And therefore, I think there has been an impulse from people to go, God, I'm not an expert. I don't know about this. I'm going to pass this stuff on to the Quangos and the regulators, whether those people like it or not, right? Look at, I think, the Online Safety Act. Ofcom saying, we don't want this, right? Not only are you even telling us we've got to do stuff, you're not even telling us how we're going to do it. And you're telling us to kind of write our own job description for this. That's not what we signed up for. We signed up for like watching telly and like counting swear words and things, right? And so this is the kind of managerial revolution that James Burnham was writing about in 1942. And you go and read that now and you go, this feels incredibly recent. So that's one part of it, I think, where that power has been diffused out because people are scared of wielding it. And that suits the powers that be just fine. It suits the civil service just fine, because really the same sorts of people who go and work in private offices of government ministers or the rest of those departments are the same sorts of people who go to the Quangos and the regulators. That is how they get their external experience, right? It's not by going off and working in a business or something. They'll go and be farmed out for a couple of years at the Environment Agency, at the whatever it will be, some regulator, and then come back and that will be their, I've seen the outside world now, I've got all this new experience type thing. So the same sorts of people. And then, of course, they're very happy to, as Dominic Cummings has talked about, use the ministers as just a kind of spokesperson, right? They are just reading the lines out. And when something goes wrong, they're also the fall guy. It takes a fairly shallow, brittle person to be willing to do that and not kick up a fuss about it. We mentioned Jenrick quitting because he wasn't willing to be part of that kind of charade. And so I think it all comes back to, again, your point about having the legislation in mind of what needs to be changed. It's not just enough to be reactive to saying, well, we'll scrap this, we'll scrap that. And again, credit to Chris Philp, I think there's so much crap that now needs to be afwared that would actually be a very noble thing to do. It's at a deeper, more structural level where trying to do any of these things without first fixing the judicial review system, the way that it works, without fixing the fact that when Starmer loses in the next election, only 200 people across the whole of the British state will change jobs. 100 ministers, 100 special advisors, people like me, and those special advisors don't even have any actual executive authority. All you can do is say, well, I recommend this, and I've read all those briefings, and they're lying to you. Again, please don't sign it, boss, which I got bored of saying, right? Only 200 people change jobs across that whole system. That needs to change. You need to have more people with more executive authority to come in and be able to do some of this stuff. You need to change a lot of this legislation on day one, or you're not going to be able to do it. And I think the last thing I'll say on it, the inspiration we can take from this is from the people who are planning Margaret Thatcher's ascent to power. So there's a guy called John Hoskins who was a successful businessman, sold up and thought, look, I'm going to get taxed into oblivion here. So I'm either going to try and save the country or I'm just going to leave. He got himself into politics. And there's a clever guy who'd built a business himself, took it from first principles and wrote this very nerdy wiring diagram. Have you ever seen it?
No.
It's amazing. And so he kind of went through all of these different kind of problems. It's sort of, inflation and trade union power and all these different bits, and kind of traced them upstream to what the first few things you'd have to do is. So you get to those kinds of first principles. And it was that systems thinking that he then tried to implement and get done when they were in government. And everybody thinks that it works. And it only half did, because they dealt with a lot of the economic problems. But you get these lovely bits in his memoir, which is called Just in Time, where he says, I made a note that this person, some civil servant, is my enemy, right? And I'm going to come back at a future term and we're going to get them. And he never does, unfortunately. And as a result, Thatcher never cut back a lot of the thicket of these things and the kind of permanent bureaucracy and civil service. So what needs to be happening now, and all the people watching at home, this is your mission for the next couple of years. And it doesn't matter if it's the Conservatives or Reform or anything to some level, because it's the same fairly apolitical stuff that needs to get done, is to identify those root problems. And I think it's massive civil service power this time round. It's massive power that have been frittered away from Parliament. Right? We saw that with the EU, but it's happened in loads of other areas where power has just been sluiced into different areas. Identify all of that. And again, as Connor was saying, identify the particular bills, the particular clauses in bills that on day one, big repeal act, get all of it gone straight away. And also then, I think, people themselves, unfortunately, need to go. Who was it who said that science advances, sort of one funeral at a time, right? That lovely line. Oh, but not funerals in this case, obviously, but people need to go in en masse. And when Truss and Kwarteng tried to just get rid of one perm sec, obviously didn't work because the system rushed up to defend it. It needs to be a lot of people changing and a lot of new plans coming in and ministers holding the responsibility themselves, something like Wes Streeting has actually done with NHS England. And Starmer, again, made a rod for his own back on this immigration point. That is exactly what you want, because then they will sink or swim, but they will sink or swim based on power being in their own hands. And that's the way that you fix things.
I really hope that isn't the last thing you say about it, because I would think we should talk more about it. But first things first, I want to talk a little bit more about, and it's funny you mentioned Thatcher there and the sort of the power struggles and the sort of ideological wrestling within the Conservative Party that went on in the 1970s, because Kemi Badenoch seems to me to have adopted a very pedestrian strategy. She doesn't really seem to have the measure of the moment. She believes that she can basically LARP being Thatcher and say things like, I'm not going to come out with fully fledged policies, I'm only going to come out with my principles, and then you'll get these op-eds written by people like Charles Moore and written by people like Simon Heffer saying that this makes her the reincarnation of Thatcher. This seems to me to miss a great many things that make our current moment very different from what was going on between, let's say, 1974 and 1979. I think the first one would be that in the 1970s, without doubt, the most salient issue in British politics was the state of the economy and inflation. Today, it is immigration, and Kemi suffers the optical defect of being, in her own words, a first-generation immigrant who has a proven track record of lobbying for greater immigration in the time when that's the first thing. The second thing, when a sort of 14-year-long betrayal took place, many people have criticisms of the way that Heath governed between 1970 and 1974. He was quite wishy-washy on the prices and incomes policy. He didn't adopt a kind of steadfast systems thinking of the kind that you were saying that John Hoskins did, and helped to, I think, fund places like the Centre for Policy Studies that later morphed into was sort of the brain trust for the later Thatcher government. But we're talking about 14 years of betrayal where you need to re-win trust, not just 4 years of wishy-washiness in which you can get a new person in. Kemi obviously had her fingerprints on much of that. And they're also, thirdly, facing potential electoral extinction to their right, as we saw in the recent local elections in which the Conservatives performed pitifully. So the idea that you can just replicate this Thatcher strategy circa 1974 to 1979 for winning power is ludicrous. You say there's a fourth?
Yeah, there is a fourth.
Yes.
Twitter,
yes.
The speed of political communication has rapidly accelerated because you now can't plan your briefings to hit the morning's newspapers. I mean, actually, Reform learned this the hard way with the coordinated hit on Rupert Lowe, which he then immediately refuted with a few tweets in an afternoon and won a lot of favour back.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. This is the starkest difference between Jenrick and Kemi. Jenrick is doing these, to-camera, snappy, in-the-morning briefings, which by the evening are getting CPS convictions overturned that were completely unjust. I mean, the conviction of the man burning the Quran is still unjust, but, the phrasing from you've offended the institution of Islam to you've offended a couple of Muslims, baby steps. Kemi's not doing any of that. Her communication is very tightly controlled, and when she does do these long-form interviews, like with the trigonometry guys, for example, it doesn't reveal any more about her character, which is the entire purpose of those long-form interviews. So I think to add that on that they haven't adapted to the times is also a limiting factor.
Yeah, and so do you think? This begs the question: do you think that the Conservatives should basically get rid of Kemi? She's proved completely useless over the last 9 months, and get Jenrick in instead. And would that change their political fortunes at all, in your opinion, James?
You've correctly identified all of the problems that Kemi and co are facing. I think that the nice thing is that a lot of those are surmountable, not the legacy point, but changing your comms is not that difficult to do these days, right? I'm not very good at some of this stuff, but you guys are, plenty of other people are. You can get people in that can start doing these kinds of videos and be harder hitting, and just need someone to sit down and say, look, actually on things you care about, and there are issues that she clearly cares about more than others, you're great, right? On the trans stuff, for example, like she clearly does actually really believe in that, really care about it, did some good work actually in government when it was very unpopular and difficult to do. And fair play to her, right? We said that everyone kind of going along with the tide, she did not do that, right? And say, look, you really care about that stuff, great. You need to now transmit some of that into these other things and not be so scared and so timid in terms of the being managed on this stuff. I think Connor's point is exactly right. On those long form interviews where you're supposed to get to know somebody, it doesn't work to do that very Blair, Cameron era, Paxman Newsnight, just play the defensive shot every single time. It doesn't work. And again, the point about Twitter, the point about reform coming from the right are all true. So you can't do the long, quiet, let's sit down and have nice policy things like Thatcher did. Of course, she had people working on that in the background while she was learning to get better at this stuff. Right? Yeah. She was not very good when she first started. Labour thought they definitely won the next election coming up. She went off and did voice training. Right? Her voice gets deeper and she gets much more confident as time goes on. She learns to give speeches better. She learns these things a bit better. And that she was willing to learn and grow. We've seen Jenrick, I think, learn and grow massively from his resignation through the campaign, and now he's getting better and better all the time, and that's a real hunger. And I think that when you're the leader and you've got CCHQ around you and you feel all that extra pressure, you feel the need to not lose, right? There's a sort of bias towards holding on to what you've got, and I think that given it is, as you say, fairly existential with reform coming along, all of that's got to be thrown out, right? Sunak tried that, doesn't work. You might as well die knowing rather than die wondering. And so I think you want to see her come out swinging, all guns blazing. That would be the way to restart her leadership.
But there are still two other problems. The first one is the fact that she is, in her own words, a first-generation immigrant who, at a time when immigration is the most salient issue in our politics, and there is a rising sense, I would argue, of host population consciousness in this country, to the effect of we're in danger of being sort of demographically swamped and having our culture, which is obviously linked to demographics, you can't really separate the two, being changed irrevocably by that. And not only, like, it would be different if she was a first-generation immigrant who was what Eric Kaufman calls an ethno-cultural traditionalist, namely someone who wanted to see the British people preserved and thriving in their own homeland, rather the same way that if I went to Japan, I wouldn't want the Japanese people to be gradually or quickly or at all replaced by British people. That would be that would not be the sign of a respectful guest in a society. She is, in her own words, a first-generation immigrant. But not only is she not such a person, she tries to reduce Britain to a set of Mickey Mouse values. That's bad enough.
Or Michaela School.
On Michaela School, yes, exactly. She wants us to be sort of hyper-monitored and sort of school-marmed into being nice and fluffy and all the rest of it. But she's also got a track record of lobbying for greater immigration visas. And even though I do give her credit on trans, and I don't mean to take any of that away from her, it is telling about her mindset and her philosophy, which she's talking about the need for her principles to be out in the open, for her philosophy to be out in the open, that in the process of going to war on trans, she would often fall into woke moral language herself. And the most obvious example would be when she said that, the two most obvious examples were when she said that David Tennant was a sort of stupid white actor. It makes me, she's managed to find the only unobjectionable thing about David Tennant, namely that he's a white Celt. And she did the same thing about her sort of left-wing university students, university colleagues. I think she was at the University of Sussex doing engineering, and she never tires of telling us. And she was like, I was just surrounded by stupid, rich, white lefty kids. And so it's just like, you're actually falling into the woke moral language games in the course of supposedly fighting against the trans iteration of woke. So I just think this makes her completely untrustworthy on all of these things, despite her, I'm sure she has, notwithstanding, I'm sure she does have some virtues as a person, and she seems perfectly nice. I don't mean to say anything other than that, but I just don't think she can be the credible leader of a restoration of Britain for all of the reasons I've just listed.
Can I just make one small addition to there as well, which would affect Jenrick were he to be the leader? Even if you change the person on the door, Kemi, Truss, Jenrick, Sunak, the crooks are still in the building in terms of the people that made poor candidate selections at CCHQ. Yeah. And Kemi has a very solid record on the trans issue. She was backing Liz's ban on all of it, which Labour filibustered off the floor by discussing ferrets and things like that. Yeah. I was kicked out of the Conservative Party for my tweets against children transitioning by CCHQ has-beens. Now, unless you gut the institution, replace it with true believers, Kemi, Jenrick, whoever, aren't going to be able to get anything done either. So is the rot, let's say, rot deeper than the leader? Let's say Kemi does the Thatcher rebrand and comes out swinging. Is CCHQ in a position to support her if she did that?
Yeah, I know what you mean. As a fun aside, by the way, the entirety of the Truss premiership I was the women and equalities spad because
Didn't know that.
because Nadim Zahawi, along with being the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and we were responsible mostly for burying the Queen because that's all there was time to do really, and he was the Minister for the Four Nations or whatever it was, so I was the spad for that as well. He was also the Equalities Minister, and so it was me actually doing some of the first stuff on fighting against Scotland's gender recognition work.
Good on you, mate.
So obviously I'm very equality me, you can, as everyone can see. I'm not sure what mean names some would call me, but so on the actual meat of the question there, the weakness that Kemi's got, that Harrison says, I think actually is a strength as well, because so many people are still, despite what Starmer said, very, very scared and timid to say the wrong thing. And not just to say the wrong thing, they don't want to be mean, they don't want to be offensive, right? I think most Brits, let's say white Brits, like my parents, so people in their 70s, they don't just want to not say the wrong thing to not get in trouble. They genuinely don't want to upset anybody, right? They've been told you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that, and they want to do the right thing. And therefore having somebody who is unencumbered by that fear and therefore can say these tough, difficult things ought to be an enormous superpower on these issues. And can come along and say, look, I struggle to integrate in some ways. I didn't know about this thing. I didn't know about that thing. And then I grew to love this place. And I can tell you that you don't need to feel bad anymore. These sorts of things. Right? This is what happened, again, with my old boss, Nadim Zahawi. He was lucky, I think, that he came as a child and he came as a sort of teenager. And I think, therefore, there are a few really crucial developmental years that you miss out on, right? So Zahawi will remember kind of kids' cartoon shows that perhaps Kemi wouldn't have remembered from her own year in the same way. And Zahawi came here when he was 9 years old. His dad was about to be killed by Saddam Hussein. They all had to kind of flee. And he therefore learned the language from scratch and all these things. And is much more British in the sense of understanding if you and I are best mates, I'd insult you. He'd get that at a really easy level, the way that some people who arrive later wouldn't. Deeper traditions that he wouldn't even understand because you kind of breathe it in when you grow up and around British people. And I think there's a struggle that Kemi's got there, but it means that she could explain this stuff more intellectually and say, look, I really do appreciate the values of this stuff because I had to learn it through actual, knowledge accretion rather than just kind of culture, which I suppose is like tacit knowledge. So she's got a superpower there and can make a virtue out of that. And it's, I think, still to be done, shall we say. But there is still the chance to do that. On the point about CCHQ, absolutely right. I got 4 months under the start of Rishi's term before my old boss got done on a very minor scandal that no one cares about anymore, trying to do an early reform of CCHQ in the knowledge that we were probably going to lose. And therefore, if we lost and it wasn't done then, you fall back from all the government departments into central office. And if it's a mess, you've got to rebuild all of that before you can start taking the fight. I got 4 months of doing that. And the idiot chairman, Richard Holden, who came along afterwards, obviously dropped all of that in favour of trying to find himself a safer seat than the one he currently had.
And then sent the wrong leaflets out.
And was bloody loyal to the Northeast and all that kind of absolute rot. And so now what's happened is they have actually at least gone back almost to kind of the base layer in CCHQ. Lots of people have left who should have left a long time ago. And although there's not a huge, I think, amount of money kicking around, there is still some. And I think just today, they're advertising now for the new head of candidates, a full-time job role. Now, that is something that people watching should go and apply for or tell mates to apply for, because in a world in which there is a great Conservative revival, that is going to be so crucial at making sure that the MPs that you select are called Connor Tomlinson and are not Liberal Democrats, right? If the Tory party has any hope of getting good sound ideas and all the rest of it back in again.
I think Connor deserves a right of reply there.
I think the building would crumble to dust, and everyone, if they saw me walk through the door of CCHQ, would react like the Nazis at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. All the skin would melt off their face. I think highly unlikely, not only to my own career ambitions, that I would ever be an MP, but I would ever be allowed anywhere near the Conservative whip.
But at the beginning, this would be a real symbol and sign of intent, right?
Yep.
There are lots of people who are considering moving away to reform, who would probably be moving to reform despite the slightly mad economic ideas and despite Richard Tice saying, oh, actually, the care worker visa is great, really, and all these sorts of things.
You mean stuff like the energy, battery stuff?
Yeah, that's right.
Net stupid zero. Or catch on.
Look at that. That would be a real statement of intent. And I think, again, it's a sort of broad thing. And there were people in CCHQ who weren't really all that conservative and not interested in outcome-only process and some silly HR things that we don't need to go into, but not because they're controversial, but just because they're slightly dull. The same mindset, that same managerial revolution that Burnham talked about, the same thing that's happened in all the departments and everywhere else, happens there as well. And so there needs to be this sort of reverse Gramsciization of all of these places as well. And to realize that if you have a head of candidates who is super sound and really believes in getting kind of tax cutting, robust immigration restrictionists who know who Roger Scruton is, let alone anything else, that is a really important role. And we've neglected that for too long and thought it was just a functionary thing to do and not bothered about it.
Two, I suppose, remaining questions. One of them very salacious, and the other one very, very, very important. Boris Johnson did an interview with GB News' Patrick Christie's recently. It was very disappointing, I would argue, in many ways. But
you had expected better?
Well, no, I was hoping Patrick Christie's would press him more. Is what I mean.
Right.
I'd say that Patrick's been on the show. I like him a lot,
yes.
but I think to be fair to Johnson, probably is the sort of person who has enough charm to be quite disarming at times, and you sort of go in there wanting to give him hell, and you leave having been charmed. Nevertheless, there are rumours that he might make a comeback of sorts. There are some internal polls, or maybe even external polls in the Conservative Party that suggest that only swapping Kemi out for him would change their electoral fortunes in any way. Of course, I find this slightly baffling because he's personally responsible for squandering an historic majority and giving us the Boris wave. Nevertheless, there seems to be some kind of affection left in the country, or certainly among Conservative members, for Johnson. Even though he looks, I would argue, increasingly dishevelled and a sort of a fraction of the man he was in 2019 these days, do you think, A, this is at all likely, given Johnson's character and given the current state of the Conservative Party? And do you think, quite apart from whether it would be a good thing, which I imagine you don't think it would be, do you think it would have an effect on the Conservative Party's political fortunes?
I think that when you get polls like this, his name recognition is so good that you're going to get a big bounce just because of that, because people have heard of him and they haven't heard of other potential candidates, right? Someone like Jenrick, yet. They haven't heard of him yet. What would the point be? Right, Boris wins again. Okay, great. He goes back into number 10. And what happens?
Another million Indians?
Well, you'd get a load of stories about the dog not behaving, and you'd get whatever, has Boris been naughty again, and all these sorts of things. And does the leopard really change its spots? He was so good in those first 6 months or so when he's like, okay, I've inherited this at a really difficult time, was super disciplined because Cummings had him being really disciplined, worked on that election campaign, was so damn good on that general election campaign, right? And there are plenty of stories we can talk about just how electric he was then. And then he won and then doesn't care anymore, foot off the gas. And I subscribe because I was there entirely to the Dominic Cummings analysis that says, this was our chance to fix everything. You didn't bother fixing anything because you couldn't be bothered because you wanted to be friends with people at the Financial Times and all the rest of it instead. So what was the point in winning? And the hour is growing so late now that 4 years of someone like that not really taking anything seriously and the same old sideshow going on, it's time to ask Donald Trump for a gold card just to get out at that point. I think that there's no point in having Boris there.
We'll draw you on more of that for the member section, because for the member section we would like to talk a little bit about your experiences with one of these high-profile figures, because you've been in the room quite a bit, obviously not sharing any sensitive information, but things that viewers might find interesting. But the last question I'll ask is that one of the things that Reform has spoken about, and of course you have experience in Whitehall in the civil sort of service-like structure, is they've talked, and particularly in the Treasury, and this is crucial because Reform have talked about creating a special new department of a deportations department that would be separate from the Home Office. This obviously sounds on paper like a very, very bold move, but one of the things that made me concerned about it, and I'm genuinely agnostic about it, I want your genuine opinion, you've worked in the Treasury. One of the problems, as I understand it, with controlling immigration or bringing numbers drastically down has been that the Treasury is addicted to this very superficial GDP maximizing model of economic growth, that it couldn't care less about GDP per capita, but purely cares about GDP in the absolute. By, to some extent, breaking up the Home Office in some way, would that give the Home Office less clout around the cabinet table and make it, in fact, much easier for the Treasury to dictate our immigration policy? Or do you think that that's a good idea on Reform's part? Or would it break up the power of the Home Office in ways that would actually be deleterious?
I think it depends entirely, as what we were saying, about the planning that you do beforehand and the kinds of bits of legislation that you repeal, the changes to the way that power fundamentally is wielded, who gets the final say on these things, where there is actual accountability and all that stuff. So if you just break up the Home Office And there are arguments for and against that. It is a basket case of a place full of people who openly said they don't want to do the sorts of things you've got to do, right? And yet, which I find baffling, because my friends who've gone in and worked there, they have gone in as cuddly libertarians and spend all their days looking at paedophiles and rapists and murderers and terrorists and foreign criminals and all this horrible stuff, and they just come out haunted, right? So how you can have someone still working hidden away in there and coming out not thinking this stuff, it's beyond me. But so it's a horrible department in lots of ways, and you've got horrible things to do. If you just broke that up, as you say, make it much easier for the Treasury, which is far and away the most powerful bit of Whitehall, to just destroy them on that stuff. And it's not just the Treasury. The OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, has been very big in scoring migration very, very highly and nicely. We saw what happened with the OBR and the trust regime and how powerful it was there. And not just in these things, of course. In one example, when Steve Barclay, who was the Tory health secretary in Brexit, actually very, very good, very, very good health secretary, he wanted to roll out loads more of the weight loss jabs. And he wasn't allowed to do it. He wasn't given the money to do it because the OBR wouldn't score it because they'd never done it before, because the jabs are new, or new in this context at least. What they could do is immigration, because they'd done that before. And so the rules were in there to do it. And of course, if any minister now goes and wants to try and change those rules, you're just trying to tamper with the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility. So again, these little Blairite cul-de-sacs will catch you out if you just do these things in isolation. Some people have talked about breaking up the Treasury into a kind of finance department and an economics department. I think they do that in Germany. I don't think that's the way to do it. I think you've got to both have a chancellor and a prime minister who are in lockstep with one another. There was one good thing that Cameron and Osborne had, in the sense that they were on the same page, so you didn't get tensions there. And actually, their focus on deficit reduction was pretty good in lots of ways. Maybe it was done in the wrong ways, and they didn't do nearly enough of it, frankly.
Well, nevertheless, there was unity of purpose.
There was unity of purpose there, unlike we saw with Blair and Brown. You've got a lot of very clever, actually very powerful civil servants in that department, right? And Rishi Sunak was lulled by them into thinking, because all these briefings of, well, Rishi understands the spreadsheets because he's very smart. Well, yeah, but you would just say that to the guy anyway. I'm sure he is smart. Why is the Chancellor looking at spreadsheets at all? So you've got these very powerful people able to go and command over huge other bits of Whitehall. The people who are in charge of the education budget in the Treasury have much more of a say over how education is run in this country, frankly, in lots of ways, than the 8,500 people at the Department for Education. So you need to have a lot of more sensible, sound people in that building. Actually, it's quite a small government department compared to others. I just mentioned somehow the DFE, 8,500 people, Cabinet Office, 10,000 people, MOJ and DWP, so the Ministry of Justice and the Department for Work and Pensions, when you include the court systems and you include the job centres and things like that, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people. The Treasury is only 2,000 people, right? And they're very smart, very talented people, but they need to be replaced in any new administration by people who really care and understand and all got unity of purpose on this, so that you don't get that kind of tension. You need people with skin in the game. And I think this would be, if I could only change one thing across the way that government is run, is I would move us much more to an American system where you wouldn't have that kind of transition period exactly. It doesn't work like that here. But you would have a lot more people coming in with executive authority, with skin in the game, with belief in it, and ability to go and get things done. Because, as we said before, only 200 people change jobs of 100 ministers, 100 SPADs. SPAD's got no power. And yet the people whose job it was to do Rwanda, their job is now to stop Rwanda. People whose job it was to do X, now the job is to do completely the opposite. And I think that is completely mad. And we've seen that's why nothing works. So if you want to get a deportations department going, to answer the question that Reform's saying, it depends entirely. If you've got high quality people, you've got the legislation stuff, the fueras out of the way to be able to do it. And as you say, you've got other people with unity of purpose, great phrase you use, in order to get this stuff done. And so it all goes back to, have you got the ability to run a system in an effective way to deliver the kind of ends that you want? And if you're not able, by the way, to run a party with 5 MPs, that's my biggest concern about Reform right now. And Rupert Lowe, whatever people might think about him, obviously a super talented, smart, effective guy who's really run stuff, and lots of other smart, effective, talented guys who run stuff who would be looking at Reform, and I'm speaking to some of them, they're now put off by it. And that's going to be the biggest thing. Again, same with Boris. What's the point? Boris come back in. What would be the point in Farage and co coming in if they've not got all this planning done? If they've got this planning done and they've got the skills to do it, hallelujah, don't care. brilliant. Parties don't matter compared to that. Yeah. But if they're coming in and they cock up the best chance you've got of a right-wing party to do this because they're too busy talking about woke condiments or whatever it is, what's the point?
Minister for Bacon Sarnie.
Not Ed Miliband.
Not Ed Miliband, certainly not. Well, I mean, if we get a really heroic saviour, maybe they can do a Gladstone and be both Chancellor and the Prime Minister
now we're talking.
Simultaneously, but we may have to wait for that. James, it's been fascinating. We're going to ask you some questions, I think in particular about Nadim Zahawi, Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson. You've worked with these people fairly up close, but thank you for joining us up to this point. Connor, thank you very much as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so. Do consider signing up so that you can catch the extra segment, and we shall see you on the next one.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programmes, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.